Imagine standing inside an American courtroom. A judge sits behind the bench. The Constitution protects certain rights. The law demands evidence. Witnesses are questioned. People can be punished for crimes. And the entire system is built around one powerful idea: justice. But now imagine asking a different question. What happens when we compare some of the principles behind American justice with the teachings of Jesus? Are they completely different? Or do some of the most important ideas actually sound surprisingly familiar? Ideas like truth, fairness, mercy, human dignity, accountability, forgiveness, and the belief that no human being should be treated as if they have no value. The answer is more complicated than simply saying, American law is Christian. It isn't. The United States is a constitutional republic, and its government cannot establish an official religion. But that doesn't mean there is nothing worth comparing. Because throughout American history, religious ideas, moral philosophy, natural law traditions, and Enlightenment principles have all influenced the way Americans have talked about justice and human rights. And when we put those ideas next to the teachings of Jesus, something fascinating happens. Some principles appear to overlap. Others clearly don't. And some raise difficult questions that still matter today. So let's take a closer look. Because the real question isn't whether Jesus wrote the US Constitution. He didn't. The real question is this: what can the teachings of Jesus teach us about the way we think about justice under American law? Justice and equality. One of the first principles we have to talk about is fairness. American law is built around the idea that government officials are supposed to apply the law according to legal standards, not simply according to personal favoritism. A person's wealth shouldn't automatically determine whether they're innocent or guilty. A person's social status shouldn't automatically determine whether they're protected by the law. And a powerful person shouldn't receive a completely different system of justice simply because they have influence. That principle has a striking moral connection to the teachings found in the Bible. Jesus repeatedly challenged favoritism. He spoke with people who were rejected by society. He associated with people who were considered sinners. And he warned against judging people simply according to their outward position. One of the strongest themes in his teachings was that human worth isn't determined by wealth, power, popularity, or social status. And that's important. Because justice becomes dangerous when the powerful receive one standard while everyone else receives another. A courtroom is supposed to be a place where evidence matters more than popularity. Where facts matter more than rumors. And where the law matters more than someone's social position. That doesn't mean the American justice system is perfect. It isn't. Courts are operated by human beings, and human beings can make mistakes. But the principle remains powerful. Justice should not belong only to the powerful. Truth matters. Now let's talk about something every courtroom depends on: truth. Imagine a witness takes the stand. The entire case could depend on what that person says. One false statement can change everything. One misleading answer can create confusion. One dishonest testimony can potentially affect another person's freedom. That's why truth matters so much in the justice system. And this is another area where the teachings of Jesus create an interesting comparison. Jesus placed enormous emphasis on truthfulness. His teachings repeatedly warned against hypocrisy, deception, and false appearances. And that creates a powerful moral question for anyone involved in the legal system. What happens when someone knows the truth but chooses to hide it? What happens when someone gives a false statement? What happens when someone uses their position to make another person's story look less believable? The law has its own rules dealing with evidence, testimony, and false statements. But morality asks an even deeper question. Not just, is this legal? But, is this honest? Those are not always the same question. Something can sometimes be technically legal while still being morally questionable. And that's where the teachings of Jesus become particularly interesting. Because Jesus didn't simply focus on following rules. He repeatedly focused on the condition of the human heart. Mercy and punishment. Now we reach one of the biggest differences. American criminal law can punish people for violating laws. Depending on the offense and the jurisdiction, punishment can include fines, probation, incarceration, and other consequences. The justice system has to protect society. It has to hold people accountable. And it has to respond when laws are broken. But Jesus placed an extraordinary emphasis on mercy. And that creates a tension. Because justice asks, what consequence is deserved? Mercy asks, is there room for forgiveness? Those two ideas can sometimes feel like opposites. But perhaps they don't have to be. Think about a courtroom. A judge may have the authority to impose a sentence. But even within the legal system, courts often consider circumstances, intent, history, remorse, harm, and other factors allowed by law. The idea of mercy doesn't necessarily mean ignoring wrongdoing. That's an important distinction. Forgiveness does not automatically mean pretending nothing happened. Mercy doesn't mean victims don't matter. And compassion doesn't mean accountability disappears. In fact, one of the most interesting lessons from the teachings of Jesus is that mercy and accountability can exist together. A person can be held responsible for what they did while still being treated as a human being. And that distinction matters enormously. Because punishment can become destructive when society decides that a person is nothing more than the worst thing they have ever done. Judge not. Now we arrive at one of the most misunderstood and debated teachings of Jesus. Judge not. At first glance, someone might ask, if Jesus said not to judge, then how can courts judge people? How can a judge sentence someone? How can a jury determine guilt? Doesn't that contradict the teaching? Not necessarily. The context matters. Jesus' teachings about judgment were directed toward human behavior, hypocrisy, arrogance, and the tendency to condemn others while ignoring one's own failures. A courtroom has a different function. The legal system has to determine facts and apply laws. But Jesus' teaching still raises an important warning for everyone involved. Especially judges. Especially prosecutors. Especially police officers. And honestly, all of us. There is a difference between determining whether someone violated a law and believing that you are morally superior to that person. There is a difference between accountability and hatred. There is a difference between punishment and dehumanization. A judge may have to say, you broke the law. But that doesn't require the judge to say, you have no worth as a human being. And that distinction is incredibly important. Human dignity. Now consider one of the most powerful principles in modern justice. Human dignity. The American legal system recognizes many rights and protections designed to prevent government abuse. Due process. Protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. The right to legal representation in criminal cases. The right to confront evidence in court. And many other constitutional protections. These principles exist because government power can become dangerous when there are no meaningful limits. And this is where the comparison with Jesus becomes fascinating. Jesus consistently treated marginalized people as human beings worthy of attention. People who were sick. People who were poor. People who were rejected. People who were socially unpopular. People who others believed weren't worth their time. Jesus didn't tell people that their value came from their wealth or social status. He treated people as human beings. And that idea of human dignity is incredibly powerful when we think about justice. Because even when someone is accused of a crime, they remain a human being. Even when someone has been convicted, they remain a human being. Even when society strongly dislikes someone, their basic human dignity doesn't simply disappear. That's a principle worth remembering. The limits of the comparison. But now we need to be honest. The United States does not operate under a legal system called the law of Jesus. The Constitution does not establish Christianity as America's official religion. And American law contains many principles that come from legal and philosophical traditions that are not simply biblical teachings. The United States Constitution protects religious freedom. That means Christians can practice Christianity. But it also means people of other religions can practice their faith. And people can choose not to practice any religion. That's an important part of the American system. So when we compare Jesus' teachings with American law, we shouldn't say, the Constitution is the Bible. That's inaccurate. Instead, we should ask a more interesting question. Where do certain moral principles overlap? And where do they differ? That question is much more honest. Justice without hatred. Think about what happens when people become emotionally invested in a criminal case. Sometimes the public sees someone accused of a terrible crime and immediately decides, that person is evil. But the legal system is supposed to operate differently. An accusation isn't automatically proof. Evidence matters. Procedure matters. The burden of proof matters. And the defendant's rights matter. This doesn't mean victims don't matter. They absolutely do. It means justice is supposed to be more disciplined than anger. And that principle connects to a broader moral lesson. You can demand accountability without allowing hatred to control you. You can believe someone should be punished without celebrating cruelty. You can support victims without abandoning fairness. And you can defend justice without turning another human being into an object of hatred. That is a difficult balance. But perhaps that's exactly why justice is so important. What about forgiveness? Jesus spoke repeatedly about forgiveness. But forgiveness is often misunderstood. Forgiving someone doesn't mean saying their actions were acceptable. It doesn't mean victims have to forget what happened. It doesn't mean dangerous people should automatically be released. And it doesn't mean society should eliminate accountability. Forgiveness can be personal. Justice can be legal. Those are different things. A victim may forgive someone personally while still believing that the legal system should hold that person accountable. And a court can impose a lawful punishment without demanding that victims live their lives consumed by hatred. That's a powerful distinction. Because if justice becomes nothing but revenge, society can lose its moral direction. The goal of justice should not simply be, how badly can we hurt the person who hurt someone else? The better question is, how do we protect society, respect victims, uphold the law, and still recognize human dignity? The American idea of equal justice. Now look again at an American courtroom. A judge walks into the room. Everyone stands. The court begins. The people involved may come from completely different backgrounds, different religions, different economic classes, different political beliefs, different communities. But inside that courtroom, the law is supposed to provide a common framework. That's one of the most powerful ideas behind American justice. Not that everyone is identical, but that the law should not simply become whatever the most powerful person wants it to be. And when we compare that principle with the moral teachings of Jesus, the similarities become difficult to ignore. Treat people with dignity. Don't show favoritism. Speak truth. Show mercy. Don't be consumed by hatred. Hold people accountable. Care for those who are vulnerable. And remember that every human being has value. These ideas don't make the U.S. legal system a Christian legal system. But they can provide a fascinating moral lens through which people can think about justice. The big question. So where does that leave us? Is American law the same thing as the teachings of Jesus? No. Does the Constitution establish Christianity? No. Does every American law perfectly reflect the principles Jesus taught? Obviously not. But does the comparison reveal something worth thinking about? Absolutely. Because law tells society what rules it must follow. But morality asks us why those rules should matter. Law can tell us what punishment is allowed. But morality asks what justice should look like. Law can determine guilt. But morality asks how we should treat people even when they've done something wrong. And perhaps that's the deeper lesson. A society needs laws. But laws alone cannot make people compassionate. Courts can punish. But courts cannot force someone to have mercy in their heart. The Constitution can protect freedom. But it cannot force every citizen to. Final message. Maybe the most important question isn't, is U.S. law Christian? Maybe the better question is, what happens when a society takes justice seriously while also taking human dignity seriously? Because justice without mercy can become cruel. Mercy without accountability can become dangerous. Freedom without responsibility can become chaos. And power without limits can become oppression. The challenge is finding a balance. And that's why the conversation between American law and the teachings of Jesus remains so interesting. Not because the two systems are identical. They aren't. But because both conversations force us to confront some of the oldest questions humanity has ever asked. What is justice? What is truth? What does a person deserve? When should we punish? When should we forgive? And perhaps the hardest question of all. How should we treat another human being when we believe they have done something wrong? A courtroom can deliver a verdict. A law can deliver a sentence. But what happens inside the human heart is a different question. And maybe that's where the teachings of Jesus still challenge modern society. Not simply to ask whether someone deserves punishment, but to ask whether justice can be delivered without losing our humanity. Because at the end of the day, justice isn't only about what happens to the person standing before the judge. It's also about what kind of society we become while delivering that justice. And that is where American law and the principles of Jesus meet one of the most important questions of all. Can we demand justice without forgetting mercy?